When we think of Sauron, the Dark Lord who sought to dominate Middle-earth, fear is not the first word that comes to mind. His essence was terror itself, yet Tolkien subtly weaves in Sauron's fears that not only defined his actions, but became his greatest weaknesses. To begin with, Sauron feared annihilation, not just physical defeat, but a complete unmaking of his very essence. When we see Sauron doing things like this, we immediately suffer familiar terrifying frights, including fear of death. Sauron's power was intricately tied to the One Ring. By pouring much of his inherent power into it, he ensured his dominion over other rings of power and their bearers. However, this act introduced a terrible vulnerability. If the ring was destroyed, Sauron would be reduced to a powerless shadow, unable to regain physical form. This was not merely a fear of losing a tool, but a fear of ceasing to exist entirely. Sauron, like his master Morgoth before him, had expended so much of his essence into externalized power that his very being depended on the endurance of that power, enough to bring forth a demon not even hope to rival. But here's the most fascinating part. Sauron never imagined that the ring could be destroyed. To him, it was indestructible by any craft except his own, forged in the unapproachable fires of Orodruin. He never foresaw that his enemies would take such a course. So blinded was he by his lust for the ring's return. This blind spot, a critical flaw in his perception of others, stemmed from his own nature. Sauron could not conceive of someone rejecting the ring's power. The implications of this fear ripple through Tolkien's work. Sauron's paranoia about the ring's theft drove him to increasingly desperate measures, from deploying the Nazgul in search of Baggins to his rising wrath when Frodo claimed the ring in the Sammath Naur. In The Lord of the Rings, the moment Frodo succumbs to the ring at the crack of doom, Sauron feels the magnitude of his folly in a blinding, choking fear. In that instant, he knows his doom is tied to a single thread of fate, and he can do nothing to stop it. "How fine working with you," Lovelace says. Yet this fear of annihilation was not just practical, but spiritual. Tolkien's deeper themes of good and evil come into play here. Sauron, once a Maya of Aule, chose domination over creation. He feared the eternal void that awaited him, the same fate Morgoth suffered. A state of torment as a powerless shadow, incapable of influencing the world. For Sauron, power was his identity, and to lose it was to lose himself. Another hidden fear that shaped Sauron's actions was his dread of the Valar and the Ban of the West. This fear was rooted in the catastrophic downfall of Númenor in the Second Age. When Ar-Pharazôn landed in Aman, Sauron was caught in the wrath of Eru Ilúvatar. His physical form was destroyed, and he was forced to flee as a disembodied spirit back to Middle-earth. This event terrified him, not because he cared for Númenor, but because it revealed that he was not untouchable. The implications here are monumental. Sauron had presented himself as a god to the Númenóreans, promising them freedom from death and dominion over the world. Yet even his cunning could not prevent the intervention of the One, Eru Ilúvatar. This event humiliated him and shattered any illusion of invincibility. His inability to foresee or prevent Númenor's destruction planted a seed of paranoia, fuel his obsessive vigilance in the Third Age. While Sauron outwardly dismissed the Valar and their influence, his actions betray a lingering fear. He fortified Mordor, surrounding himself with armies, and avoided open conflict with the West for centuries. When the White Council began to challenge him, he relied on deception and proxies, rather than risking his own power. Even his retreat from Dol Guldur, when Gandalf confronted him, suggests caution born of fear. This ties directly to Sauron's greatest failing. He underestimated his enemy's resolve and underestimated the divine forces that shaped Middle-earth. The Valar remained distant, but their emissaries, the Istari, Gandalf, Saruman, etc., worked tirelessly to resist him. Sauron's fear of divine retribution likely prevented him from openly conquering lands like Rivendell or Lothlorien for much of the Third Age. He knew that to strike too soon or too brazenly could awaken powers he was unwilling to face. Sauron's greatest fear, paradoxically, was his inability to comprehend or contend with weakness. This is not a fear of weakness in himself, but a fear of something he could not understand. The strength of the weak and the humble. Hobbits, the smallest and most seemingly insignificant of beings, embodied this weakness. Sauron never accounted for them because they did not seek power. They lived simple, peaceful lives. To him, such creatures were inconsequential. This oversight became his undoing. Gollum, Frodo, and Samwise were all agents of Sauron's defeat, and yet none of them fit his vision of a traditional enemy. In Unfinished Tales, Sauron dismisses hobbits entirely, only learning of their role through his interrogation of Gollum. Even then he miscalculates, believing that Gollum's revelation of the Shire will quickly lead his forces to reclaim the ring. Whoa. He fails to understand the tenacity, resilience, and purity of heart that hobbits possess. Here lies one of Tolkien's most profound messages. Evil often fails because it cannot comprehend good. Sauron's very nature prevented him from perceiving the full scope of his opposition. While he focused on armies and kings, the ring was quietly carried through the very lands he sought to dominate. His fear was not explicit, but implicit, an existential dread of the small forces capable of undoing him. This fear also explains Sauron's fixation on the ring's location. He poured immense resources into finding it because, in his mind, whoever possessed the ring could only be another great power capable of challenging him. This tunnel vision prevented him from seeing the truth, that Frodo sought to destroy the ring, not wield it. As Gandalf states, "Help oft shall come from the hands of the weak when the wise falter." In the end, Sauron's fears reveal his deepest weaknesses and unravel his designs. Fear of annihilation drove him to paranoia. Fear of the Valar made him cautious. And fear of weakness blinded him to the most potent threat he would ever face. Where you may have missed this, dear listener, is in the quieter moments of Tolkien's work. The glimpses of Sauron's shadow in the corner of the great tapestry. His terror at Frodo's claim in the Samath Nor is one such moment, a fleeting yet monumental realization of his doom. His retreat from Dol Guldur, his obsession with the ring, and his desperate use of proxies all point to an underlying fear that governed his actions. Tolkien, in his mastery, teaches us that fear is not just the domain of the weak, but also of the mighty. Even the Dark Lord had fears. Fears that shaped Middle-earth's history and ultimately brought about his downfall. To Sauron, control was not just a tool, it was his very modus operandi. Unlike Morgoth, whose brute force and destructive nature ravaged Arda, Sauron sought domination through systems of order and subjugation. His ability to manipulate and corrupt others was central to his identity, and any loss of control represented a profound existential threat. This fear manifested most clearly through the Rings of Power. The forging of the One Ring in the Second Age marked the apex of Sauron's mastery over other wills. By instructing Celebrimbor and the smiths of Eregion in ring crafting, Sauron created a framework of deceit. The elves were given rings of immense power, but unbeknownst to them, Sauron had forged the one to bind them all. However, when the elves discovered his treachery, they resisted his influence, removing their rings and thwarting Sauron's plan. This failure had far-reaching consequences. Sauron's fear of losing control over others drove him to retaliate, waging war on Eregion in 1697 of the Second Age to reclaim the rings. While he did succeed in capturing the Seven and the Nine, the three rings of the elves remained beyond his grasp. This loss haunted him. The elves' continued defiance, amplified by the power of the three, became a thorn in his side for millennia. The fear of losing dominion over others also explains Sauron's strategy during the Third Age. His reliance on the Nine Rings, which enslaved the mortal kings who wore them, speaks to his obsession with bending others' wills to his own. The Nazgûl were his most loyal and terrifying servants, but their very existence symbolized Sauron's underlying insecurity. He needed them as proof of his mastery. Yet this reliance also highlighted his fear. Should his servants falter or disobey, his power would diminish. This fear of rebellion or failure to dominate is mirrored in Saruman's corruption. The fallen wizard, seduced by Sauron's promises of power, ultimately sought to supplant him. In Saruman, Sauron faced an echo of his own ambition, and this parallel reveals a deep truth about his fear. Tyranny breeds rebellion. Sauron's paranoia about betrayal explains his constant vigilance and his preference for fear over loyalty as a means of control. Sauron's fears are not merely personal, but also a continuation of his master Morgoth's legacy. In the Silmarillion, Morgoth's greatest fear was his own vulnerability. He poured so much of his essence into corrupting Arda that he became irrevocably tied to the world's fate. Sauron inherited this fear of mortality and applied it to his own design. While Sauron as a Maya was immortal, his fear of being reduced to a powerless spirit, a fate worse than death, shaped his actions. His master Morgoth was cast into the void at the end of the First Age, a fate that Tolkien describes as an unending torment of impotence and isolation. Sauron feared a similar fate. His survival through the destruction of Númenor and his subsequent disembodiment left him scarred and wary. This fear was the driving force behind his creation of the ring. It was his anchor to physical existence. Consider the implications. Sauron's immortality became a curse. The destruction of his physical body in Númenor left him diminished, his ability to assume a fair form forever lost. By the Third Age, his fear of final defeat, of becoming a powerless shadow like Morgoth, manifested in his desperation to reclaim the ring at all costs. Without it, he knew his spirit would fade into impotence, incapable of regaining form or influence. Thus, the ring was not only a tool of domination, but also Sauron's lifeline. Its destruction would mark his permanent banishment from the world, a doom he dreaded above all else. In a profound sense, Tolkien presents Sauron as a cautionary figure, one who sought to escape mortality by binding his fate to an object of power. But this very act ensured his vulnerability. Like Morgoth before him, Sauron feared a doom of his own making. One of the most hidden fears, and perhaps the most poignant, is Sauron's fear of redemption. At the heart of Tolkien's mythology lies the notion of repentance and the possibility of restoration. While Morgoth was utterly unrepentant, Sauron's arc reveals glimpses of a more conflicted nature. In the early days, before his corruption, Sauron was a mayor of Aule, drawn to order, creation, and beauty. Yet under Morgoth's influence, he abandoned these inclinations in favor of domination. After Morgoth's fall, Sauron had a choice. In the Second Age, when the Valar summoned him to Aman to face judgment, he initially considered repenting. In the Silmarillion, it is said that Sauron's pride prevented him from following through. He could not bear the humiliation of confessing his misdeeds and submitting to the Valar. This rejection of redemption is critical. Sauron's fear of confronting his guilt and shame drove him deeper into darkness, cementing his path as the Dark Lord. The implications are profound. Sauron was not beyond saving, yet he feared the vulnerability that comes with seeking forgiveness. Redemption would require relinquishing control, abandoning his ambitions, and admitting failure. This was anathema to Sauron's very nature. Thus, he chose to embrace his role as a tyrant rather than confront the possibility of grace. Tolkien's subtle handling of this fear adds a layer of tragedy to Sauron's character. Unlike Morgoth, whose rebellion was absolute, Sauron's fall was marked by missed opportunities and lingering doubt. This fear of redemption speaks to a universal truth. The most stubborn pride often masks the deepest insecurities. Sauron, the embodiment of tyranny and domination, was ruled by his fears that shaped his rise and ultimately led to his fall. His fear of annihilation, of losing control, of divine retribution, and of the unassuming strength of the weak all reveal a complex and tragic figure. Yet perhaps the most poignant fear of all was the fear of redemption, a path he could not walk, for it required relinquishing everything he had built. In the end, Sauron's fears serve as a mirror to his greatest weaknesses. Tolkien's genius lies in this irony. The Dark Lord who sought to conquer all was ultimately undone by forces he could neither perceive nor understand.